Naming is a central part of programming and vitally important. Everything has a name in software, and the names we give something reveals something about what it does, or it should. The difference between a good name and a bad name is a key factor in maintainability of the software that we write. Here are 7 strategies for creating better names. Number 1, use metaphors. We understand similarities and dissimilarities between things using metaphors. Using certain metaphors creates expectations that, as long as they're upheld, can define how we interact with a system. Metaphors are a central part of good design, and the names that we use should reflect the metaphors that we're following. Next, use the active voice. Methods are verbs. Classes are nouns. Let them say what they do. Adopt conventions like, if a method returns a Boolean, start the name with a is, like is verified, but don't overdo it. Opt for clarity over convention. Next, say things plainly. Spell things out with camel case so that they're easy to read and understand. Don't be afraid to create long names, even if they're like long sentences. You know, most IDEs, you only have to type the name in once. And then the next time you type the name, the first few characters, a little pop-up will come up and you can select it from a list. So you don't have to worry about typing too much. Also, name things for what they do so that they're easy to understand. Next, pluralize names for their managers. Establish conventions that make sense and stick with them. For example, I like to name leaf objects that map to database records for what they represent. For example, a user object or an auction object. And if a manager is needed to aggregate them into a collection, then I'll simply pluralize the name and call those users or auctions. But if I need sophisticated processing, like for example, caching or workload distribution, then I'll call out a manager in the name, like user manager or auction manager. That works for me. Next, spell things out. Avoid using acronyms, abbreviations, and lingo. Say what the method does in its name, but don't reveal how it does it. Don't describe implementation details. Try to say what the method does from the caller's perspective. Generally, name things generically for what they do, and the names will have more longevity. Next, make names pronounceable. Naming is a primary means of communication that we are constantly referring to in our heads and among each other. It's easy to communicate and understand names that are easily pronounceable. Unpronounceable names can be confusing to work with and really difficult to talk about. Use generic or specific names based on scope. Use short generic names for public symbols. For example, even if I'm only using one zip compress 128 object, I'll call it compress, so that if I ever need to refactor to a strategy and add other compressions for polymorphism, I don't have to change the name. Naming is a critical skill that makes the software that we write understandable and more straightforward to work with. Depend on names over comments to express what code does. This helps embed knowledge in the system and makes code self-expressive instead of having to rely on commentary of comments. It will make all the difference when people go back into the code and work with it. Until next time, happy coding.